Dear friends, today we are going to tell you a story that will send chills down your spine. It is the heart-wrenching story of an innocent sister who was subjected to cruel treatment by her stepbrother. He tormented her and even threw her out of the house while she was fasting. This incident is so painful, it may bring tears to your eyes. But eventually, divine punishment befell that cruel man, and what happened will give you goosebumps. It was an ordinary day, like any other. But fate had something else planned. The sky was covered with clouds, and the air felt uneasy, as if something terrible was about to happen. That day, too, Saima had prepared food for her stepbrother Shazaib for the pre-dawn meal, Seri. When it was time to break the fast, iftar, Shazaib brought food from outside just for himself. When Saima looked at the tray he placed in front of himself, filled with delicious food, her hunger intensified. As soon as her eyes fell on the kebabs and steamed chicken on the tray, Shazaib slapped her across the face and dragged her into the storeroom, locking the door from the outside. Saima loved her brother dearly, but in return, she always received bitterness and insults. "How many times have I told you not to interfere in my matters?" Shazaib shouted angrily. "This is not your house. I'm just doing you a favor by letting you stay here." Saima took a deep breath, held back her emotions, and quietly went back to her daily chores. She knew there was no point in protesting. Ever since her father passed away, this house had turned into a prison for her, where enduring Shazaib's cruelty had become her fate. Shazaib's hatred had no limits. Sometimes he would criticize the food just to keep Saima hungry. Sometimes, after an entire day of housework, he wouldn't let her rest. And sometimes he would hurl abuses at her for no reason. Saima remained patient because she believed that God is just and fair. But one day, Shazaib crossed all limits. He committed an unspeakable act against his own stepsister. It was a cold night. Rain was pouring heavily outside, and the thundering clouds above seemed to signal something ominous. Inside an old yet elegant bungalow, Farooq Baig was anxiously pacing back and forth. His wife, Ruqayya Begum, was groaning in pain. Tension filled the entire house as the birth of their first child was approaching. "May God protect us," Farooq Baig whispered, folding his hands in prayer. Moments later, the cry of a newborn echoed from the room. The midwife opened the door with a smile and announced, "Congratulations! It's a boy." Farooq Baig was overjoyed. He rushed into the room and sat beside Ruqayya. Their eyes fell on little Shazaib, cuddled in his mother's arms. "This is our little prince," said Ruqayya lovingly. "I will give him every happiness in the world." And truly, she remained committed to her promise. Ruqayya Begum left no stone unturned in raising Shazaib. Whatever he asked for was given to him instantly. If he got into a fight with another child, he was always considered right. If he broke something, instead of being scolded, he was given an even better replacement. "This is my little prince. I will never let sorrow touch him," Ruqayya would say all the time. As time passed, Shazaib became more stubborn and selfish. He had no regard for his father's respect, nor did he show respect to anyone else. "Mom, I want this new game." "Son, it's very expensive," Farooq Baig tried to reason with him. "Dad, you only care about money. Mom, please." Ruqayya Begum immediately glared at her husband. "A child's happiness is the most important thing." This attitude was enough to spoil Shazaib. At school, he spoke in anger, behaved rudely with everyone, and never liked to listen to anyone. Farooq Baig repeatedly tried to make his wife understand. "Ruqayya, fulfilling every demand of a child isn't right. He will slip out of our hands." But Ruqayya always had the same response. "He is my only son. I can never bear to see him upset." And this excessive pampering one day became a curse for them. Time flew by, and Shazaib turned 10. By now, he wasn't just spoiled. He had become emotionally detached. He wouldn't listen to anyone in the house. Forget respecting his father. He would completely ignore him. But then, one day, something happened that changed everything. "Mom, what's happening to you?" For the first time, Shazaib saw his mother weak and unwell. Her complexion had turned pale, she struggled to breathe, and she was constantly tired. "Son, it's probably just exhaustion, nothing serious," Ruqayya said with a faint smile. But it was not a minor illness. When the doctor conducted a checkup and looked at the reports, Farooq Baig's expression turned grave. "Mrs. Ruqayya has cancer, and it's at the final stage." As soon as this news broke, a silence of death fell over the house. Farooq Baig held his head in despair, and Shazaib could hardly believe it. "No, this can't be true. Nothing will happen to Mom." He screamed in anger. But reality could not be denied. Ruqayya grew weaker by the day, and the same son who was raised with excessive love and care now looked helpless. "Mom, please eat something." "Son, my time has come. I must go now." "No, Mom. How will I live without you?" But such is the law of life. And then came that moment when Ruqayya Begum closed her eyes forever. The entire house was drowned in grief. Shazaib, who once never listened to anyone, was now broken. He was the same person who used to get everything he wanted, but he couldn't save his mother. It had been 6 months since Ruqayya Begum passed away, but the house was still wrapped in sadness and silence. Shazaib, who always used to hide in his mother's lap and receive endless affection from her, had now become quiet all the time. At the age of 10, he had lost his mother. His father was still alive, but he could never take his mother's place. Shazaib would often look at his mother's photos and cry. A strange emptiness gripped his heart. He went to school, but he couldn't concentrate. Whenever he saw another child with their mother, he looked at them longingly and shattered from within. Farooq Baig was also deeply saddened, but being a man, the world didn't give much importance to his grief. His close friends began advising him that life couldn't go on like this. "There needs to be a woman in the house, for Shazib's sake and for your own," they said. "But how can I let someone else take Ruqayya's place?" Farooq Baig would reply. "Life doesn't stop," his friends insisted. "Shazaib also needs someone." Eventually, Farooq Baig gave in to his friends' pressure and agreed to remarry. The girl's name was Nasreen. She belonged to a middle-class family, very simple people. Nasreen had no one in this world except her mother, who had become seriously ill. Her mother wanted to find a good man to marry Nasreen to before she passed away. She wished to entrust her daughter to someone trustworthy before her death. When Shazaib heard the news, he was furious. "Dad, you've forgotten my mother," he shouted. "No, son. How could I ever forget your mother?" Farooq Baig tried to explain gently. "I don't want a stepmother." Shazaib slammed the door shut in anger. But children's anger can't stop what life has planned. The marriage happened, and Nasreen entered the house. She was much younger than Farooq. Her mother agreed to the marriage only because of her own failing health. The woman who arranged the marriage told her that Farooq Baig was a kind man with his own house, so she was convinced. After the wedding, Nasreen treated Shahzaib with great kindness. She tried to give him love, but he felt it wasn't genuine. "Son, you'll get used to me," Nasreen said with a gentle smile, but Shahzaib didn't respond. Time passed, and day by day, Shahzaib's hatred for his stepmother grew. "She's not a good mother," he would complain to his father. "I don't like her. Send her away from the house." But Farooq would try to make him understand. "Son, she is also your mother now. She takes care of everything for you. You should treat her with kindness." Nasreen proved to be a good wife. She cared not only for Farooq Baig, but also looked after his son with sincerity. Still, Shahzaib continued to misbehave with her. One day, Farooq scolded Shahzaib harshly, but Nasreen stopped him. "Children need time. Don't say anything to him. I'll handle it." "No, he's becoming stubborn and unruly. We need to discipline him strictly," Farooq replied. Gradually, Nasreen began to accept Shahzaib's stubbornness and cold attitude, yet she continued to care deeply for him. He remained constantly irritated with his stepmother, and whenever he spoke to her, he would always say, "This is my house." Poor Nasreen endured everything silently. Farooq Baig, however, was content, believing that Nasreen had taken charge of the house very well and was also taking good care of Shahzaib. Nasreen was a kind-hearted and simple woman, but for her, the greatest test was Shahzaib. He was still struggling with the grief of losing his mother and was not ready to accept anyone else in her place. Nasreen had realized that she was walking a difficult path. She knew that a 10-year-old boy who had lost his mother couldn't easily accept another woman in her place. But Nasreen didn't give up. "Shahzaib Beta, I brought some chocolates for you," she said with a gentle smile, offering him the chocolates. Shahzaib cast a cold glance at her and pushed the chocolates aside with contempt. "I don't want anything from you, and I'll never accept you as my mother," he growled and walked away into his room. Nasreen quietly smiled to herself. She knew it wouldn't be easy, but she had made a promise to herself. She would win Shahzaib's heart. Every day, she treated him with kindness, cooked his favorite meals, and took care of his belongings. But in Shahzaib's heart, one thought kept repeating. "This woman has come to replace my mother, and I'll never forgive her for that." Farooq Baig, who had always been a serious and reserved man, didn't pay much attention to Shahzaib's behavior. He believed that everything would get better with time. "Nasreen, just be patient. Shahzaib is still young. Gradually he'll get used to you," he would say. "I'm trying to be patient, but he doesn't even talk to me," Nasreen said sadly. "Just give it some more time," Farooq would always reply. But his detachment was only fueling Shahzaib's hatred further. 4 months had passed since Nasreen's marriage, when one day she shared some good news with Farooq Baig. "Allah has blessed us with another gift. I'm going to be a mother," Nasreen said shyly. A pleasant surprise spread across Farooq Baig's face. "That's wonderful news," he said joyfully, and held her hand with happiness. But when the news reached Shahzaib, it hit him like a thunderbolt. "You're going to be the mother of my father's child?" he said, his heart sinking in disbelief. It felt like his mother's memory was being completely erased from his life. "This house belonged to my mother. And now you've changed everything. And now you'll bring your own child so my father will forget about me too," he screamed at Nasreen. Nasreen saw the immense anger and hatred in his eyes, but she remained silent. With time, the situation got worse. Shahzaib completely stopped talking to Nasreen. If she passed by him, he would turn his face away. If she offered him food, he wouldn't even touch it. Months passed, and finally, the day arrived when Nasreen gave birth to a beautiful baby girl. Farooq Beg was overjoyed beyond measure. He named the baby Saima. The entire house was filled with happiness and celebration, but standing quietly in a corner, Shahzaib was watching everything silently. The moment he saw Saima for the first time, a wave of intense hatred arose in his heart. She is that woman's daughter. She has come to take my place. Now Dad will only love her, he thought bitterly. From that day onward, Shahzaib developed resentment in his heart for Saima too. Whenever everyone was showering love on her, he would sit far away, consumed with jealousy. When Nasreen held Saima close and rocked her to sleep, Shahzaib would clench his fists in anger. One day, while Nasreen was feeding porridge to little Saima, Shahzaib came closer and said sarcastically, "Now, you don't need me anymore. You have your own daughter now." Nasreen looked at him in surprise. "Shahzaib Beta, you are mine too, just like Saima. You both are my children." "No, I'm nothing to you, and your daughter means nothing to me either," he shouted and stormed out of the room. Nasreen sighed deeply. She knew she couldn't change the hatred in his heart overnight, but she was not someone who gave up easily. Time went by, but instead of softening, Shahzaib's coldness only grew harsher. Every time Nasreen tried to bring him closer to Saima, he would firmly reject it. "Shahzaib, Saima is your little sister. Just hold her once." "I don't want to touch her." "Why do you say that, Beta? One day she'll call you brother." "I don't want to be her brother," he snapped. Nasreen's eyes filled with tears, but she stayed silent. Farooq Beg tried many times to make Shahzaib understand, but he refused to let go of his bitterness. "Listen, son, I know losing your mother wasn't easy, but Nasreen truly cares about you, and Saima is your sister. Don't look at her with hatred. You've changed too, Dad. You don't care about me anymore. All you care about is your new wife and daughter," Shahzaib replied angrily. Farooq Beg fell silent. He knew that Shahzaib's heart wasn't ready to change yet. As Saima started growing older, Shahzaib's hatred continued to grow with her. When Saima laughed, it made him angry. When she looked at him, he turned away. One day, Nasreen left little Saima near Shahzaib. The innocent baby, who was only a few months old, reached out and tried to grab Shahzaib's shirt with her tiny hands. "Stay away!" Shahzaib snapped and harshly shook off her hand. Saima began to cry, and Nasreen came running in. "Shahzaib, why did you push her?" "I didn't do anything. She must have fallen on her own," he replied coldly, and walked away. But for the first time, Nasreen felt a strange fear inside her heart. What if this hatred turned into a storm one day? The wheel of time kept turning, and before anyone realized, 12 years had passed. Shahzaib was now a 22-year-old young man, serious on the outside, but filled with bitterness and hatred within. His eyes still reflected the same old harshness, the same resentment, and the same detachment from his step relations. On the other hand, Saima had grown into a 12-year-old innocent girl who always loved her elder brother dearly, but Shahzaib never considered her a sister. He always saw her as the daughter of his stepmother, not as his own sister. Nasreen had spent her entire life trying to win Shahzaib's heart with love and affection, but all her efforts went in vain. Shahzaib never accepted her as a mother, nor did he ever accept Saima as his sister. Even now, he would often complain to Farooq Beg, "You shouldn't have remarried. If you hadn't married again, at least I could have lived with the memories of my mother." Shazaib would often say this in anger. Nasreen would quietly listen and pray in her heart that someday his hatred would fade. But that day never came. One morning, Nasreen had prepared breakfast for everyone and set it on the table. As usual, Shazaib left the house without eating anything. Saima, who was always close to her mother, sat at the table and cheerfully said, "Mom, today I want to go to the park with my friends. Will you come with me?" Nasreen gently placed her hand on her daughter's head with affection. "Yes, my dear, but first I need to go to the market to buy a few important things. We'll go in the evening," she replied. Saima was overjoyed, but little did she know that her mother would not be able to fulfill that promise. Nasreen left the house to go to the market. On the way, she stopped at a vegetable cart to buy some groceries. The weather was pleasant, with a gentle breeze blowing, and the market was bustling with people. Lost in her thoughts, Nasreen didn't notice when a speeding truck suddenly lost control and came charging toward her. She had no chance to escape. The truck hit her with full force, and she collapsed onto the road. People around screamed in horror. Chaos spread everywhere. A stream of blood flowed down the street, and within moments, Nasreen's breathing stopped forever. The same Nasreen, who had dedicated her entire life to others, now lay helpless and lifeless on the road. No one could hear her cries. No one could feel her pain. At that moment, Shazaib was with his friends when he suddenly received a phone call. On the other end was his father's panicked voice. "Shazaib, get to the hospital immediately. Nasreen has had an accident." Shazaib's heart didn't soften at all. But on his father's insistence, he came to the hospital. When he arrived, his father was already there. But the news he received at the hospital entrance didn't stir even the slightest emotion in Shazaib's heart. Farooq Baig was sitting on a bench with his head down and tears in his eyes. The hospital staff stood nearby, trying to comfort him. When Farooq Baig saw Shazaib, he barely managed to lift his head. His eyes were filled with tears. "Nasreen has left us. She is no more," he said with trembling lips. Shazaib felt no sorrow. He had never truly accepted Nasreen as his mother. The atmosphere at home was mournful. Silence had taken over everything. Saima was still in shock. She couldn't understand where her mother had gone. "Dad, when will Mom come back? She promised to take me to the park," Saima asked her father innocently. Farooq's throat went dry. He didn't know how to tell his innocent daughter that her mother would never return. Saima kept asking again and again, but no one had an answer. Eventually, when the women in the house tried to explain it to her, she burst into tears. "No! Mom can't leave me. She made a promise. She said she would come back. She will come. She has to," she screamed. Her cries filled the entire house with a heavy silence. Every eye was filled with tears, and every heart was drenched in sorrow. Shazaib didn't feel a shred of grief over the loss of his stepmother, but Saima cried all the time. The innocent child wasn't ready to live without her mother. After Nasreen's passing, a permanent gloom settled over the house. Ever since Ruqayya's death, the house had already been lacking warmth and affection. But Nasreen, with her love and effort, had kept everyone together. Now that she was gone, it felt as if every wall of the house was mourning. For Farooq Baig, Nasreen's death was a deep emotional blow. He was never fully ready for that marriage in the beginning, but over time, Nasreen had become an essential part of his life. She cared for him and understood his worries. Now, all that remained in his life was loneliness. He would often sit for hours, silently staring at Nasreen's pictures. Saima tried to sit close to him, but seeing her father's helplessness, she would start crying too. "Dad, don't be sad. I'm here," Saima said one day, holding his hand. But how could that innocent little girl know that even fathers fall apart without a mother? On the other hand, a big change had occurred in Shahzaib's life. He had gotten a job at a good company with a handsome salary. He was very happy because he had always wanted a beautiful life. When he brought the news home, he thought maybe Farooq Baig would be happy. "Dad, I got a job," he said excitedly. Farooq Baig lifted his head. A strange spark appeared in his eyes, but it didn't last long. He simply replied, "That's good, son. May Allah bless you with success." Shahzaib felt that his father's words lacked the warmth and enthusiasm they should have carried, but he also understood. It wasn't easy for his father to feel happiness after Nasreen's passing. Over time, Farooq Baig had grown even weaker. He had become quieter than before, barely eating properly. Saima used to cook meals with her own hands, and Farooq would often help her. Lately, Farooq's health had started to decline. One day, Shahzaib said to him, "Dad, you should see a doctor." But he gently refused with a faint smile. "I'm fine, son. It's just that my heart feels a little heavy sometimes. Just take care of Seema." Hearing Saima's name, Shahzaib turned toward his father with anger in his eyes. His hatred for his stepsister hadn't faded even a little. Farooq Baig perhaps didn't even realize that his heart was truly ill. One night, while Saima was asleep in her room and Shahzaib was busy with some work, suddenly a loud cry came from Farooq's room. Shahzaib rushed in and found his father clutching his chest, gasping in pain. "Dad, what's happening to you?" He panicked and ran to him, but Farooq couldn't speak. His eyes were half open, and his breathing was erratic. Shahzaib immediately called an ambulance and took him to the hospital. The doctors confirmed it was a heart attack. He had become very weak and needed complete rest. After spending a few days in the hospital, Farooq Baig was brought back home, but he was no longer the same. He had grown more fragile, had difficulty walking, and would often sit lost in deep thought. Saima would sit beside him and try to talk, but the sparkle in his eyes was gone. One day, Saima came and asked, "Dad, why are you always so quiet?" Farooq Baig looked at her and replied with a soft smile, "Time has changed a lot, my dear." But this change wasn't just about time. It was about his heart too, which was no longer strong enough to carry on. It was just an ordinary morning, but no one knew it would be the last morning of Farooq Baig's life. Shahzaib was getting ready to leave for work, when suddenly Saima came running, screaming, "Brother! Dad! Dad has collapsed on the floor!" Shahzaib rushed into the room. Farooq Baig was lying motionless on the floor. His breathing had stopped, and his eyes were fixed toward the sky. Shahzaib's heart started pounding. "Dad! Dad!" he called out, shaking his shoulders, but there was no response. He immediately called the doctor. As soon as the doctor arrived, he looked down and said softly, "I'm sorry. Your father is no longer in this world." Hearing this, Saima let out a heart-wrenching cry. "No, Dad can't leave me. He will always be with me." Tears welled up in Shahzaib's eyes. Once again, a shadow of mourning loomed over the house. First Nasreen, and now Farooq Baig. For Saima, it was an unbearable shock. She had already lost her mother, and now the only pillar of support she had
Her father was gone too, but even for Shabib, this loss was deeply painful. He had never imagined losing his father. After the funeral, he sat in his room, eyes heavy with tears, thinking about how he had always remained angry with his father. But now he was gone. Several months had passed since Farouk Baig's death, but the sorrow in the house still lingered. Seem had lost both her parents. Now, her only support was Shahzeeb. But the same Shahzeeb, who already hated her now, became even more ruthless. He had always resented Saima's presence. He saw her as the symbol of his stepmother Nasreen, whom he had deeply hated. When Farouk Baig was alive, he at least maintained some restraint. But now that there was no one to keep him in check, his hatred started taking a more cruel form.
"Why are you still living in this house?" he shouted at Saima one day. Saima, who was in the kitchen making tea for herself, stepped back in fear. "Brother, what did I do wrong? This is my home too." Hearing that, Shahzaib's anger exploded. He stepped forward, snatched the cup from her hands, and smashed it on the floor. "Seeing your face ruins my entire day." Tears welled up in Saima's eyes. "Brother, I just want to take care of you. I don't need your sympathy," he snapped, gritting his teeth, and shoved her out of the room. This wasn't the first time Shahzaib had treated Saima harshly. He often scolded her without reason, restricted her food, and made her do all the household chores. If she ever sat down to rest for a moment, he would immediately yell, "This isn't a house for maids where you can relax. Go clean the floor." He would intentionally throw trash on the floor just to make her clean it again. Saima quietly spent her days working endlessly. She was innocent, helpless, and had no one to complain to. One day, she gathered the courage to say, "Brother, I want to go to school. I want to study." Hearing that, Shahzaib's anger soared like never before. "Study? You want to study? So you can grow up and try to bring me down like your mother did?" Shahzaib shouted. "No, brother. I just want to make my life better," Saima replied softly. But instead of listening, Shahzaib slapped her hard across the face. "I will decide what happens in your life. Understand?" he growled. Saima fell to the floor, but her spirit didn't break. Deep down, she promised herself that somehow she would try to change her circumstances. Shahzaib started treating her even more harshly. Sometimes he even forced her to go to bed without eating. One day, as she sat down to eat, Shahzaib snatched the plate from her hands. "This food was bought with my money, not your father's," he said bitterly. "But brother, I'm hungry," Saima said in a trembling voice. "If you're hungry, then go get a job." "I'm not even allowed to go to school. Who will give me a job?" she asked helplessly. "That's not my problem," Shahzaib snapped, throwing the plate outside. Tears streamed down Saima's cheeks, but she said nothing. The holy month of Ramadan had begun. Saima would wake up every day at Sehri, pre-dawn meal, and cook food for her brother too. Shahzaib, however, started eating iftar outside every day and never brought anything back for Saima. For a few days, she survived by making simple bread for herself. But when even the flour ran out, she finally said, "Brother, there's nothing left at home." "So, what do you want me to do? I'm not your servant who'll take care of your expenses. Go earn your own money." Saima was starving, especially during the blessed month of fasting. Desperate, she went to her neighbor, Aunt Fatima, and said, "Auntie, please give me some work. I'll help you with anything. Just let me eat in return." Aunt Fatima was a kind woman. She said, "Come every day and help me in the kitchen. Once the iftar is prepared, you can take your meal home." Saima began doing that. Every day, she would go to Aunt Fatima's house, help her with kitchen chores, and bring her iftar meal home before evening. But this started bothering Shahzaib. One day, while Saima was returning home, a group of street boys tried to tease her. Just then, Shahzaib was approaching from the opposite direction. Seeing what was happening, he grabbed Saima by the arm and dragged her back into the house. He beat her mercilessly. She kept crying and screaming, "Brother, please don't hit me. I didn't do anything." But Shahzaib didn't stop. He didn't even let her eat anything that day. Poor Saima fell asleep hungry and thirsty. Even at Sehri, she only managed to eat some leftovers from Shahzaib's plate and kept her fast. Later that day, while she was offering the Zuhr, midday, prayer, Shahzaib came home and began knocking on the door. Saima, still in prayer, didn't answer. By the time she finished praying, Shahzaib had already climbed over the wall and entered the house. He stormed inside, grabbed her by the hair and shouted, "Tell me, why weren't you opening the door?" He started beating her again. "Who was inside? Who did you call?" He looked around in suspicion. "Brother, please, there was no one. I was just praying," Saima cried and pleaded. But Shahzaib didn't stop. That day, he beat her severely. Saima couldn't stop thinking about her late mother and father, longing for the love and protection she had lost. Saima wept bitterly and prayed to Allah, "Oh Allah, please save me." The next day, Shahzaib was with his friends. One of them offered him a drug-laced cigarette. When Shahzaib returned home, Saima wasn't there. That day, Shahzaib hadn't even kept a fast, while Saima was fasting. When Shahzaib arrived home in a drugged state, Aunt Fatima was hosting a Quran recitation gathering at her house, and Saima had gone there. Shahzaib felt hungry and kept calling out, "Give me food!" But when Saima didn't come, he went to the kitchen, took food from the fridge, and placed it on the stove to heat. He carelessly threw away the matchstick without putting it out. The matchstick landed on a curtain, which caught fire. Soon, the fire began to spread rapidly. Shahzaib panicked. He had no idea what to do. He became trapped inside the kitchen. But when Saima returned and saw smoke inside the house, she ran straight toward the kitchen. Seeing her brother in danger, she rushed in, without caring that the flames might burn her too. Shahzaib was trying to put out the fire with his bare hands. Saima held on to him and dragged him outside. Her own scarf caught fire, but thankfully, she managed to survive. The neighbors, seeing the smoke, came running and began throwing water on the flames. Eventually, the fire was extinguished. Saima took her brother to the hospital and cared for him with all her heart. After that incident, Shahzaib became quiet and withdrawn. He was ashamed of everything he had done. He looked at Saima and said, "Please forgive me. I've always wronged you." He got Saima enrolled in school. He deeply regretted the way he had treated her all those years. Now he had realized his mistake. He thought to himself, "From now on, I'll take care of my sister. I'll never let a single tear fall from her eyes again."